She shot Mussolini in the face and almost changed history forever, but instead of medals, Violet Gibson got locked away and erased. And have you ever heard of the heiress who traded royalty for madness? Yeah, neither had most people, until now. A privileged start. Violet Gibson was born in Dublin in 1876. She came into the world surrounded by power, influence, and money. Her father, Edward Gibson, was the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. That made him the highest judicial officer in the country and one of the most powerful men in the British Empire at the time. The Gibson family carried the title of Baron Ashbourne, and with that came a lifestyle that most people couldn't imagine. Violet grew up in a grand Georgian townhouse in Dublin and spent her summers at country estates. She had servants, tutors, and all the comforts that came with being part of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. She had private lessons at home, and her teachers were hand-picked from the best universities in Britain. Everything around her told her she was special. The way people bowed when her father entered a room, the way servants stood quietly nearby, and the way society treated her with automatic respect. This was the only life she knew. She was also introduced to the world of royal balls and formal dinners at an early age. These events were designed to teach girls like Violet how to speak, act, and marry within their class. By the time she was a teenager, she had already met Queen Victoria during her official presentation at court. It was expected that Violet would marry someone with a title or a large estate. These marriages weren't about love. They were business deals dressed in lace and pearls. Violet, like most girls in her circle, was raised to be quiet, graceful, and agreeable. She knew how to host a tea party, ride a horse, and play piano. But beneath all the surface charm, there wasn't much space for freedom. Still, people in Violet's world believed they were at the top for a reason. The British elite thought they had a duty to rule, to advise, and to be the example for everyone else. Violet's father helped shape Irish law during a time of massive political tension, especially as more Irish people demanded independence. But inside the Gibson household, none of that unrest touched them. Violet didn't grow up around protest or struggle. She grew up in a bubble, one lined with expensive wallpaper and centuries of family pride. That didn't mean she was happy. It just meant she had no reason to complain, at least from the outside. To everyone else, she had everything a girl could want: wealth, status, and education. But having everything doesn't always mean much when it's not what you want. And as she got older, Violet started drifting away from the world she was raised in. The mansion, the manners, the polished dinners, they started to feel hollow. And soon, her health also started to worsen. Illness in childhood. She was constantly sick. By the time she was a teenager, she had already survived scarlet fever, pleurisy, and peritonitis, serious illnesses that could have killed her. One after the other, her body was put through fevers, pain, and long periods of bed rest. She spent weeks in her room, separated from other children and wrapped in blankets instead of attention. Her world was shrinking before she even had a chance to grow into it. What made it worse was how her mother chose to handle these illnesses. Instead of bringing in doctors or following medical advice, Violet's mother turned to Christian Science, a religious movement that believed sickness was just an illusion. Followers were taught that if your mind was in the right place, your body would heal on its own. So instead of giving Violet medicine or rushing her to the hospital, her mother told her to pray. That meant long hours of silence and faith, but no physical help. Even when Violet was clearly in pain, the answer was always the same: no doctors, no treatment, just spiritual belief. Her mother wasn't being cruel on purpose. She truly believed Christian Science was the answer. But Violet was the one paying the price. Her childhood became a cycle of illness without real recovery. The infections left scars, not just on her body, but on how she saw the world. She learned early on that her suffering didn't always lead to action. And these weren't just short-term illnesses. Pleurisy affects the lungs and makes breathing painful. Peritonitis is a dangerous inflammation of the abdominal lining that often requires surgery. Without medical care, the damage from those conditions could linger for years. It's likely that her immune system never fully recovered. The pain stayed in her joints, in her chest, in the way she moved through life with a kind of physical fragility that never quite faded. This constant state of being unwell affected her mentally too. Being isolated while sick can make a child feel invisible. Violet spent more time with books and thoughts than with other people. She began drifting inward, away from the outside world. Her body had limits, and so did her sense of safety. If she cried out, no one brought help, only more silence and prayer. That shaped how she saw control, pain, and trust. People around her expected her to recover and return to her lessons and social duties as if nothing had happened. But underneath the dresses and manners, Violet was always carrying a kind of quiet exhaustion. A lonely debutante. By the time Violet Gibson turned 18, her future had already been mapped out. Like many young women in the British aristocracy, she was presented at court as a debutante. That meant standing in front of Queen Victoria, wearing a gown with a long train and feathers in her hair, while being formally introduced as a young woman ready for marriage. It was a high-pressure tradition designed to launch girls into society and onto the path of finding a suitable husband. For most, it was the first major milestone in a carefully curated life. On paper, Violet had everything she needed to succeed in that world. She was well-bred, attractive, and came from one of the most respected families in Ireland. She had the manners and the family name. Her debut meant invitations to private balls, dinners with the elite, and access to the most powerful circles in London and Dublin. She was surrounded by peers who had been raised with the same expectations: to smile, charm, and marry well. But Violet didn't take to it the way others did. While most of her friends leaned into the social calendar and the matchmaking games, she began pulling away. She still attended events, but something had shifted. She seemed distracted at dinners, quiet during conversations, and uninvested in the carefully staged rituals of courtship. People noticed that she didn't seem excited about any of the eligible bachelors around her. She danced when she had to, smiled when expected, but she wasn't really present. Her family probably assumed she was just shy or slow to warm up. But Violet was starting to question the world around her. The pressure to marry was everywhere. Mothers whispered behind closed doors about potential matches. Fathers measured suitors by land, titles, and family connections. Violet understood the rules, but the more she saw of the marriage market, the more it unsettled her. So, she started turning down invitations. When she did attend, she stayed on the edges of the room, watching more than participating. She didn't feel like she belonged with the other debutantes, even though they'd all come from the same background. Their lives seemed to fit into the world they'd been born into. Hers didn't. She was supposed to be looking for a husband, but she was looking for something else entirely, though she probably couldn't name it at the time. Her parents tried to guide her back on track, encouraging her to spend time with family and friends and join social outings. But Violet was already drifting. From the outside, she was still the debutante daughter of Lord Ashbourne, but inside, she was starting to pull away from the very world that had raised her. Turning to spiritualism. By the time Violet Gibson was in her 20s, the world around her was changing. London was full of new ideas, movements, and beliefs. For someone like Violet, raised under strict rules and high expectations, the world of spiritualism offered something different. It was about exploring the unknown, and she was drawn to it. She started reading theosophical texts, the kind that talked about the soul, reincarnation, and hidden knowledge. These books were sold in small shops near lecture halls and printed by societies that believed in life beyond the physical world. The more she read, the more she wanted to understand. She wasn't looking for light entertainment. She was looking for answers that the Anglican Church and her family's traditions hadn't given her. She began attending lectures in London, often in quiet halls filled with people who didn't care about titles or lineage. Some of them were scientists, others artists or writers. Many were like Violet, educated but restless, curious but unsatisfied with what they had been taught. She listened as speakers discussed karma, the afterlife, and Eastern philosophies that were rarely mentioned in her old world. These weren't things you talked about at dinner with a Lord Chancellor. But Violet wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was searching for something she couldn't name. Soon she joined spiritual groups and discussion circles. These gatherings were different from the formal clubs she grew up around. There were no dress codes, no invitations printed on fine paper. People gathered in simple rooms, sat in circles, and talked about the unseen. Some believed in spirits. Others talked about energy fields and past lives. Violet didn't agree with everything, but she stayed. The experience of sitting among people who questioned everything gave her a sense of freedom. This shift didn't go unnoticed. Her family had always expected her to follow a certain path, to marry well, attend church, and live according to the customs of her class. But Violet had started moving in the opposite direction. Her beliefs made her stand out. She began to think more deeply about pain, healing, and the soul. She read about spiritual discipline, inner silence, and the possibility of a deeper connection between the mind and the universe. Her connection to Eastern philosophy grew stronger. She read translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts. She underlined lines that talked about suffering and transcendence. It wasn't just curiosity. Violet was someone who had known emotional and physical pain, and these teachings gave her a framework that felt more honest than the polite silence of her upbringing. Back home, she was still expected to show up, dress well, and smile, but something had shifted. Conversion and conflict. By the early 1900s, Violet Gibson had completely drifted from the world she grew up in. She was living in London, away from the strict expectations of Dublin society. In 1902, she did something that shook her family to the core. She converted to Roman Catholicism. For an upper-class Anglo-Irish Protestant family, this wasn't just strange. It was seen as betrayal. Her father, Edward Gibson, had built his life on law, logic, and status within a Protestant empire. Catholicism, especially in British and Irish elite circles, was considered lower class, foreign, and even threatening. But Violet didn't care. She wasn't trying to rebel for attention. She genuinely believed that the Catholic Church held answers to something deeper. She'd been carrying a growing sense of guilt and pain, and religion gave her a way to organize it. Violet became drawn to the rituals of Catholicism, the silence, the symbols, the confessions. She started reading the writings of saints and mystics. She visited churches across London, sat for hours in prayer, and filled notebooks with spiritual thoughts. Her family didn't understand any of it. Her conversion created tension at home. Her relatives didn't like discussing it, and some even refused to speak to her. The more distant they became, the more Violet leaned into her faith. She started writing to priests and friars for advice. She made pilgrimages to monasteries and shrines. She confessed her sins often, sometimes daily, even when there was little to confess. Her faith stopped being a comfort and slowly became a kind of obsession. She started believing that suffering was necessary, that pain could cleanse the soul. She fasted for long periods and sometimes refused food altogether. She punished herself for thoughts she believed were impure or selfish. At first, the people around her thought she was just becoming more devout, but over time her religious habits became harder to explain. Her letters became more urgent. Her journal entries started focusing on sin, shame, and divine punishment. Even some of the priests she wrote to told her to slow down. They tried to guide her gently back to more balanced thinking, but Violet didn't want balance. She wanted absolution. She believed her pain had a spiritual purpose. She thought God was trying to teach her something, and she had to listen no matter how much it hurt. Her days started revolving around rituals, lighting candles, saying long prayers, walking alone through churches. These became the center of her world. She avoided social events and stopped caring about the rules of her old life. She wasn't interested in parties or fashion anymore. She was looking for something sacred, even if it meant turning away from everyone who once knew her. And just as her faith deepened, a rare chance at love offered her a different kind of salvation, but it wouldn't last. Love and loss. It all started when Violet Gibson moved to London in her early 30s. She settled in Chelsea, a neighborhood known for its painters, poets, and dreamers. This part of the city felt different from the world she'd grown up in. It was slower, more personal, and full of people trying to create something lasting. Violet became part of that scene quietly. She wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but she found her place among artists who accepted her without titles or rules. It was there that she met a man who changed her life. He was a painter. Talented, thoughtful, and gentle in the way Violet needed. No one expected her to fall in love with someone like him, but she did. And for a brief moment, she saw a different future, one built on connection, not tradition. They got engaged not long after meeting. It wasn't the kind of engagement that made the society pages. There was no royal approval or formal announcement, but for Violet, it was the most real thing she'd ever felt. He encouraged her to write, to read freely, to speak her mind. With him, she wasn't the daughter of a baron. She was just Violet. Then, without warning, he died. 1 year after they got engaged, he was gone. The cause of death isn't clear in surviving records. Some say illness, others mention a sudden accident. But the details didn't matter to Violet. All she knew was that the person who made her feel seen had vanished. She never got engaged again. She never courted anyone or flirted at parties. After his death, she pulled away from anything that looked like romance. Friends noticed the change in her. Her laughter became rare, her presence more distant. She still attended gatherings now and then, but it was like watching someone walk through a fog. She smiled at the right times and said the right things, but something inside her had shut down. That loss wasn't just personal, it shifted something in how she saw the world. Love, once full of promise, became a memory tied to grief. She kept his letters. She stopped mentioning his name in conversation. When people asked about marriage, she would change the subject or offer a polite answer that didn't invite more questions. This moment in her life marked a turning point. Before him, she had followed rules she didn't always believe in. With him, she saw a way out. After him, she started to drift. Her thoughts grew heavier. Her journals took on a more serious tone. She read more philosophy, more religious texts, and fewer novels. She turned inward and stayed there. The energy she once gave to society or even her own appearance slowly faded. She had once believed in duty, then she believed in love. After that, she believed in almost nothing. And soon, her mind began to spiral towards suffering and silence. Physical decline and mental strain. So by the time Violet Gibson reached her 40s, her body had started turning against her. What began as aches and discomfort grew into a long series of medical problems. She suffered from chronic pain that wouldn't go away. Doctors performed multiple surgeries on her abdomen and chest, trying to fix what they thought were physical issues. But nothing brought lasting relief. Her health was breaking down, and so was her trust in the people trying to care for her. Medical language at the time didn't leave much room for understanding women's pain. Violet was diagnosed with hysteria and nervous exhaustion, vague terms that blamed emotional instability rather than anything physical or treatable. The doctors didn't have clear answers, and they didn't seem to be looking for any. They assumed her body was reacting to her mind, and her mind, they believed, was the real problem. They prescribed rest, isolation, and spiritual calm. None of it helped. Violet grew more withdrawn. She began to avoid friends and stopped attending family events. Even the quiet walks she once enjoyed became too much. She no longer trusted doctors, but she didn't trust her own body either. Every small pain felt like a sign of something bigger. Every conversation felt like a trap. She stopped opening letters and refused to speak to people she once confided in. The world outside seemed colder and more dangerous. She believed people were watching her. Sometimes she thought they were testing her faith. As her physical condition worsened, her writing shifted. She used to keep journals filled with observations and religious thoughts, but now the pages were full of guilt, fear, and punishment. She wrote about sin and salvation with a kind of urgency that worried the few people still close to her. She believed she was being called to suffer, not in the poetic sense, but as a real purpose. Her body's pain became linked to a spiritual mission. She saw herself as someone chosen to endure suffering for a greater good. She also became obsessed with ideas of purity. She believed the world was corrupted and that only deep, painful sacrifice could cleanse it. Her journals became harder to follow, filled with underlined words and phrases copied from the Bible. She wrote about fire, angels, and judgment. She talked about hearing messages, not out loud, but in her thoughts. She believed these messages were sacred instructions. People who knew her during this time described her as both quiet and intense. She could go days without speaking, then suddenly recite long passages from Scripture. She rejected comfort and pleasure, thinking both were distractions from her true calling. The pain in her mind was necessary. The isolation, the fear, the physical suffering, she believed they were all part of something bigger she couldn't explain. So, withdrawing from England, she sought refuge in Rome, not for recovery but for religious devotion. But what began as a retreat soon became an obsession. Withdrawal to Rome. In the early 1920s, Violet Gibson moved to Rome with her nurse, Mary McGrath. Her family had grown more concerned about her behavior, and she needed constant care. The move wasn't publicized, and there was no farewell from friends or a formal goodbye. It was a quiet departure. Violet wanted to be somewhere sacred, and Rome gave her that. She chose to live near the Vatican, in a neighborhood where the buildings were close together and the walls felt heavy with history. She chose a small, modest convent with plain rooms and strict routines. She shared simple meals with nuns and spent most of her time in silence. She stopped attending social functions, gave away her fashionable clothes, and began wearing simple dresses. Rome, for her, became a place of retreat. She walked the city with her head down and avoided drawing attention. She no longer wanted to be seen. Every morning, Violet attended Mass. She sat in the back pew and kept her hands folded. She spoke only when necessary and never lingered for conversation. She believed her purpose was not to be liked or admired, but to pray and prepare herself. She filled notebooks with passages from religious texts and quoted from saints. She underlined certain phrases again and again. There were no drawings, no personal stories, just strict devotion. She began fasting more often and cutting back on food. She would spend long hours kneeling, sometimes refusing to lie down at night. She wrote notes to her nurse asking to be left alone for long periods, even though she was often physically weak. Her health was failing, but she didn't ask for medical help. She said she was answering to a higher power now. Her daily life became centered around rituals, schedules, and acts of religious discipline. Soon, she started to read about saints who suffered for their beliefs and wrote about their punishments. She believed pain had a purpose and that some people were chosen to bear it. She wrote that her suffering had meaning, even if others didn't understand it. Her thoughts circled around ideas of purity, failure, and redemption. The world outside the convent began to feel distant. Violet no longer lived with one foot in society. She had stepped away completely, and she didn't want to return. Her isolation fed her beliefs, and her beliefs soon began feeding something darker, preparing for something bigger. Violet Gibson no longer spoke about faith in a quiet or personal way. Her prayers had taken on a new tone. She had started to speak about people in power as agents of something darker. She said the world was being poisoned by political evil. She believed powerful men were spreading suffering under the mask of leadership, and they were doing it with pride. To her, this was a sin. She believed divine punishment was coming. She didn't say when or how. She just repeated that the world had gone blind and that something had to be done to wake it up. She didn't name specific countries or leaders at first. But as she read newspapers and followed speeches, her attention narrowed. She wrote notes about corruption. She spoke to her nurse about judgment. And every time someone questioned her beliefs, she stood firmer in them. During this period, Violet made a decision. She went into her room, took a small revolver she had kept hidden, and aimed it at her chest. Before pulling the trigger, she read a passage from the Bible. The bullet hit her ribcage and lodged in her shoulder. Her nurse found her lying on the floor. Violet was badly hurt but alive. She said she didn't do it out of sadness. She said it was meant to be an offering. Doctors were called and she was treated quickly. Her recovery was slow but steady. Violet said her survival wasn't a mistake. She believed she had been spared for a purpose. She said God had kept her alive because her mission wasn't complete. Her attempt hadn't ended her life. It had confirmed her calling. Her nurse noticed a shift in her tone after that. Violet began speaking in short, intense sentences. She referred to herself as a servant of God's will. She stopped making small talk and spent more time in silence. She wasn't afraid. She said fear was no longer part of her life. Everything she had gone through, her pain, her survival, her isolation, had been leading her to something she believed she could no longer avoid. Then came April 7th, 1926, the day Violet Gibson stepped into history. The day she fired the gun. On the afternoon of April 7th, 1926, Benito Mussolini stepped out to greet a crowd in the Piazza del Campidoglio in Rome. He had just finished delivering a speech to an international group of surgeons celebrating the latest achievements in modern medicine. The sun was out. People gathered to cheer for the man they called Il Duce. Supporters shouted and waved as Mussolini moved through them with confidence. He was still early in his reign, but his image was already being shaped as a fearless leader who walked among the people without fear. Violet Gibson stood among that crowd. She was small, quiet, and unnoticed at first. She wore black gloves, a modest coat, and walked with a soft shuffle that didn't attract attention. In her right pocket, hidden under a black lace veil, was a small revolver. On her left, she carried a rock. She had planned every detail. If Mussolini was in a car, she'd break the glass with the stone. If he was on foot, she'd walk right up to him. She had no bodyguards, no backup, no escape route. Only the belief that this was the moment she had been waiting for. As Mussolini passed through the crowd, shaking hands and smiling, Violet moved forward. She got close enough to raise her arm and aim the gun at his face. She fired once. The bullet grazed the bridge of his nose. Blood started to run down his cheek. Mussolini flinched but didn't fall. Before she could fire again, Violet pulled the trigger a second time. The gun jammed. In that instant, the crowd noticed what had just happened. People screamed and rushed at her. Some tried to strike her, but police officers pushed through the chaos and grabbed her before the mob could take control. She was dragged away, beaten and dazed, but still alive. They pulled her into a nearby building where she was given a sip of brandy to steady her. Her hat was gone. Her gloves were torn. Her coat was ripped at the sleeve, but she was calm. Mussolini refused medical treatment at first. He stood tall, made a show of brushing off the injury, and continued his public appearance with a bandage on his nose. His message was simple. He had survived, and he wasn't shaken. The newspapers praised his strength. Photos of him with a wound on his face circulated within hours. Violet, meanwhile, sat in a small, locked room under guard. She didn't run, she didn't cry, she didn't deny what she had done. The gun was taken. Her name was recorded. She was an Irish woman. She was 50 years old. She had no criminal history, no political party, and no accomplice. Just a revolver, a rock, and a belief that she had done what she was meant to do. Declared insane and sent away. After the shooting, Violet Gibson didn't run. She didn't struggle or lie when the police pulled her from the crowd. She stayed quiet. When questioned, she gave short, calm answers. She didn't deny what she had done. She told the officers that she fired the gun to serve God. She didn't show fear, and she didn't ask for help. The people holding her expected a political explanation or some kind of group conspiracy. Instead, they got a woman who spoke about faith and sacrifice. Violet was taken into custody and placed under constant supervision. While Italian officials tried to decide what to do next, doctors were brought in to assess her mental state. They wanted to know if she was acting on her own or if others had helped her. She said she had planned it alone. She wasn't part of a movement. She didn't even seem angry. She simply said it was necessary. Her statements confused the authorities. Violet wasn't unstable in the way they expected. She answered questions clearly. She knew what year it was. She could recall dates and explain her actions. Still, the doctors labeled her as mentally unfit for trial. The diagnosis was chronic paranoia. They described her beliefs as dangerous and disconnected from reality. Her religious focus, her obsession with self-sacrifice, and her calm acceptance of punishment made them nervous. They said she posed a threat, not just because of what she did, but because of what she might do next. The decision was made to avoid a public trial. Italy was already under Mussolini's control, and the state didn't want questions about how a foreign woman got that close to him. A trial might draw more attention to how serious the attempt had been. There were also political risks for Britain. Violet was the daughter of a former Lord Chancellor. She came from a family that had deep connections to the British elite. Both governments wanted the situation to disappear quietly. Behind the scenes, the British Foreign Office began to work on a deal. They agreed that she would be declared insane and deported. No formal charges, no public hearing, just a quiet handover between governments. The goal was to move her out of Italy as quickly as possible, with as little noise as possible. When the decision was final, Violet was removed from her cell and handed over to British officials. Her sister came to collect her, accompanied by police officers and a nurse. Violet was weak and still recovering from the beatings she had taken after the arrest, but she carried herself with quiet formality. She even wrote a thank you letter to the Italian prison director before leaving. Her handwriting was neat and her tone was polite. The journey back to Britain was quiet. They moved through France without incident. Violet didn't try to escape. She didn't make a scene. Her sister kept a close eye on her during the entire trip. Once they reached London, there was no homecoming or family reunion, no newspaper reports, no statements from officials. Violet wasn't taken to her old house or allowed a few days of rest. She was taken directly to Harley Street to be examined by doctors. The evaluations didn't take long. She was checked, certified, and declared insane once again. That same night, without delay, she was transferred to St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton. The hospital was a large psychiatric institution built far from the public eye. She was given a room, her personal items were stored away, and the doors were locked behind her. That was where she would stay. Not because she had been found guilty, but because two countries agreed it would be easier if she was forgotten. From that point on, Violet Gibson became a patient, not a person. But locked away in silence, she never stopped writing. But no one wanted to listen. 30 years behind walls. Once inside the asylum, she became a permanent resident, and her life shrank to the size of a locked ward in Northampton. She was 50 years old when she arrived. She would spend the next 30 years within the same walls, surrounded by staff, schedules, and silence. Each day followed the same rhythm. She walked the halls in silence. She attended church services inside the hospital when permitted. She spoke little with the other patients, most of whom were kept sedated or confined. Her energy went into writing. Violet still saw herself as someone who could shape the world, even from inside a mental institution. She wrote letters, carefully worded and addressed to powerful people. She reached out to the British Prime Minister. She wrote to Winston Churchill. She even addressed letters to the young Princess Elizabeth. Her tone was respectful, but her message always circled back to the same idea. There was a divine mission still waiting to be fulfilled. None of her letters ever reached their destination. The staff at St. Andrews read them, filed them, and then placed them in storage. Some were never opened. The hospital's mailroom had its own rules, and Violet's words rarely passed through its filter. In her mind, she was still in contact with leaders and royalty. In reality, she was writing into a void. Her thoughts never made it beyond the gate. She continued to journal as well. Her entries were a mix of prayer, reflection, and political commentary. She saw meaning in small things. A passing cloud, a change in the weather, a sound in the hallway, each one held a message, and she recorded them faithfully. Her handwriting grew shaky over the years, but she kept writing until her fingers could no longer hold a pen. Her room was filled with notebooks, folded papers, and scraps where she had written thoughts she didn't want to lose. Her family, once a major presence in Ireland's legal and political world, stepped away completely. No one visited her. No one wrote back. Her sister, who had once helped escort her back to England after her release from Italian custody, made no effort to petition for her freedom. Her brother Willie, who had been her moral compass in earlier years, had died long before. Violet became a ghost to the people who once shared her bloodline. There was no scandal to protect anymore. There was only distance, and it grew with each passing year. As time passed, the staff at St. Andrews changed. New doctors and nurses came in with no memory of her past. She became another patient on the ward, known mostly for her quiet habits and her need to be alone. Younger nurses were told to watch her in April when her mood sometimes became unpredictable. They weren't told why April mattered. They only knew it was the month when her behavior changed. Many didn't even know who she had once tried to kill. In those last years, Violet spent much of her time feeding birds in the hospital garden. She liked to collect crumbs from the cafeteria and scatter them along the gravel paths. She never spoke much, but she liked to hum while she walked. Her hair had gone completely white and her body had grown thinner each year. She wore long skirts and shawls, always layered against the cold, even in summer. Patients came and went. Nurses transferred in and out, but Violet remained, part of the furniture now, barely noticed. She never asked to leave, not because she had given up, but because she no longer believed she was meant to live outside. She had come to see the hospital as part of her mission. It was her desert, her penance, her test. She believed God would let her go when the time was right. Until then, she waited, not in fear, but in faith. No funeral, no farewell. And then, in May 1956, Violet Gibson passed away quietly inside the walls of St. Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital in Northampton. She was 79 years old. There was no public announcement, no ceremony, and no farewell. After 3 decades spent behind locked doors, her death came and went with no family around her and no headline to mark the moment. She was taken to Kingsthorpe Cemetery, a small burial ground not far from the hospital. No relatives were there, no friends, just a simple grave and a name few people remembered. By then, most of the world had already forgotten the woman who once stood inches away from Mussolini and pulled the trigger. The newspapers didn't cover her passing. Her name didn't appear in political columns or on the front pages. For years, her story had been avoided, scrubbed, or rewritten. In Britain, her act had embarrassed the government. In Italy, she had been dismissed as a strange outsider. In both places, silence was the easiest way to handle her. The psychiatric staff at St. Andrews followed their routine after her death. Her body was prepared without ceremony, her few possessions stored away, and the paperwork filed. There were no floral arrangements, no eulogies, no official recognition. Her final years had been spent in seclusion, and her end followed the same pattern. There was no one left to speak publicly about her life or her choices. Her relatives, once high in political circles, had long distanced themselves from her name. The people who had once celebrated Mussolini didn't want to revisit the attempt on his life. In the years after the war, as the world came to understand the damage caused by fascism, there was no movement to recognize Violet's actions. Her shooting had come too early, before the world was ready to condemn the dictator. At the time, Mussolini had still been treated as an ally in some British circles. Violet's attempt had been viewed more as a nuisance than a warning. For decades, even her grave remained unnoticed. There was no sign to mark its importance. People walked past it without knowing who lay there. Historians who came across her name found little to work with. The official records labeled her as insane. The government files were limited. Family archives were locked. Her life had been flattened into a few lines in medical and legal reports. The woman who once believed she had been chosen for something greater died as if she had never mattered at all. And that's it, folks. Thanks for watching. If you found Violet Gibson's story as haunting and powerful as we did, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden history, and drop a comment. Should she have been remembered as a hero? See you in the next one.